Well, I think the big picture answer to that is that the risk appetite of the private sector is very substantially curtailed. Much less money available, shorter maturities, more onerous and difficult terms. So that's the short answer to that. Obviously, in circumstances where that's apparent, you get some responses. In regional development, the big multinational institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank and so on, have put much more emphasis and are going to devote much more resource to infrastructure development in the region. But the private sector is also responding. There are some new sources of long-term finance, particularly from the Japanese banking system that's got a surplus of savings. But I think when you look net-net, there's going to be less from the private sector. It's going to be harder to get on more difficult terms. So that says that the public sector sponsors have got to use what they've got more efficiently. Well, I think you start with the analysis because there is just not widespread knowledge of what is possible and what the best methods are for attaining better infrastructure. So you start with analysis, and then I think the next big task, or simultaneously, is the task of passing that information through to the policymakers so that the policymakers understand the range of their options, the constraints on their options, and what is possible. And then the education task, I think, goes wider because it's got to get through then to execution. What are the best methods of doing things? What are the best terms that are available? How can big and complex projects be best managed? How is best practice brought to particular projects in Australia? And a way of looking at this, a jargon-ridden way of looking at this, is to describe this as removing the information asymmetry that exists, or at least reducing the information asymmetry that exists between many of the participants.
Thank you.
Probably not yet, not very extensively. There are, I think, 4 very interesting trials going on at the moment. You could call it an investment because some of those have got funding budgets of, I think, up to $100 million. So that's very serious. But what they're trying to determine is what the best systems are at the moment, best systems available at the moment are. But we haven't seen what consumer response really is. What kind of signals can be sent? How are people going to respond to those? What is the regulatory intrusion going to be? Because that is a risk to some of the theoretical outcomes that might prevail. And I think there's a lot of learning going to come out of the trials that are going on at the moment. Incidentally, there's a very important role potentially for SMART in the near term, because the data that comes out of these trials will lend itself to a lot of modelling and simulation and the design of second and third level trials. So obviously smart grids have got immense potential, but we're pretty much at day one in a long journey. Well, I think if you look at it in a political and more strategic dimension, we've got to provide security. What do all our buyers look for? They look for energy security, and that is one of the big issues for any economy in the region. So we've got to be, first of all, seen to be a secure, dependable supplier. So that gets back to Infrastructure 101. The supply chains have got to be rock solid all the way up the river where the natural gas is delivered, or the coal. Second, we've got to be sensitive to the probable, possible, and maybe technological developments that are going to be required as we clean up energy. As we clean up energy, the types of energy will change, but we'll also modify through technology the forms in which we supply some of the energy. So it behooves us to be as close as we can to the forefront of the scientific development of more efficient energy use. Well, potentially the contribution that SMART can make in the region is immense, and the problem for SMART is actually going to be prioritising what it tries to do. The demands for infrastructure across the region are, of course, huge. You can look at the Asian Development Bank studies and so on. They're also very complex because what has been realised is that a network approach, which has often not been applied in specific geographies, will give them a much bigger payoff. And grand things like the Mekong Delta transport system across several countries would potentially offer each of those countries much greater benefits than pursuing their own narrow agendas. Very big, very complex, inadequate capacity in many of those economies to manage, obviously inadequate capacity to finance the requirements. So SMART, as a regional participant, has got a huge canvas on which to work. Just being disciplined and getting the early payoff is probably what's important.
Thank you.